Hello, BookTube. I have another starter kit for you, this time on the Vikings. It was suggested to me by Elena Makridina, and I took her up on it right away because A, I love her channel. I'll leave a link to it down below. And B, I love the Vikings. And C, as a historical footnote, it happens that at the moment her country and my country are run by the same man. So I would get right to the subject now. The beginning of any period like this is going to be a little fuzzy, and that is true with the Vikings as well. But the discrete beginning that historians tend to use just as a benchmark, and that you're perfectly okay in using, is an early day in June in AD 793, when out of the freezing cold oceans of the north to the coast of England came a bunch of raiding ships with their prows carved in the shape of monsters and oared and crewed by magnificent warriors for whom plunder and sacking were consolation prizes. Unlike any other raiders that the coast had ever faced, these warriors mainly wanted a glorious death in battle. And it's tough to beat a crew of men whose main goal is to die fighting you. It's tough to beat them. If they want money, you can buy them off. And once the Vikings got more comfortable, that is what they wanted. But they were big and fierce and struck the civilian, unaware inhabitants of coastal England and Ireland as creatures that stepped right out of a mythology. They almost didn't seem human, both in their joys and in their enjoyments. They were fond of drink, they were fond of carousing and singing and women, but also in their depravity. The things that they would do to civilians just for their own amusement were horrific. They still have the power to shock. And in a starter kit, therefore, about the Vikings, the place that you want to start, unlike with any other historical phenomenon that I can think of, is mythology, not fact. The place to start with the Vikings, in order to understand them, in order to get ready for reading about them, is to start with that mythology, the mythology that they did indeed step out of, the mythology that was in their hearts and minds the whole time. The weird mythology of the Nordic lands, which was, again, unlike any other mythology in that it had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the end was hopeless. so the true consolation of being alive was to die and fight forever in Valhalla. And that a bed death, a straw death, a death where that was denied you, was not always a disgrace, but certainly something to be avoided. If you were hale and hearty, you wanted to die in battle. And that made the Vikings terrifying to the civilians, even the professional soldiers who fought them. And in order to understand them, to get into their mind frame, so to speak, you really need to start, I think, with the mythology. So the first few things that I want to recommend are mythology, quasi-myth, legend, that sort of thing. Like this big volume from Penguin Classics, this Penguin Classic Deluxe Edition, gorgeous thing, the Sagas of the Icelanders, because the mythology here was codified into Icelandic sagas, the Icelandic sagas that are such a literary treasure, and a great selection are in this book. This is a real book to have. One of the greatest storehouses of a lot of the myths that drove a lot of these men is the Elder Edda, and I love this version by Paul Taylor and W.H. Auden. Just a collection of Norse mythological stories that give you a real insight into the world, and because you can map on the behaviors and the humors and the wry cynicism of their gods and goddesses, you can map from that what a lot of the Vikings themselves thought and felt. So if you can find this edition, this edition of the Elder Edda is one of the only ones I've ever read, one of the only translations I've ever read, that actually manages to please in a way that I imagine is similar to the way the original pleased. Most of the other translations of the Elder Edda that I have read, most of the other translations of any Norse mythology that I've ever read, strike me as translations. They come off that way. So if you can find this one, that would be great. Don't think it's in print anymore, but you are accustomed to that. Another thing that I think might not be in print, it would be a terrible shame. The last of our mythological retellings is a favorite of mine from a long time ago. His name is Roger Lancelyn Green. In my opinion, he never wrote a bad book. He wrote popular volumes retelling the mythologies of different nations. He did one for ancient Greece. He did one for the Egyptians. He did one for Finn MacCool and the myths of the Red Branch cycle in Ireland. And he did one for the Vikings. This one here, the myths of the Norsemen. This is what it looked like a long time ago. If it's in bookstores now, it won't look like this. But this is wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. I'm being bumped all over the place here by my own little Viking, because this is what they look like. The same fierce, beady eyes, the same gigantic mustaches. This is what imagine a longboat full of this coming straight for you. But if you can find Roger Lancelyn Green, I highly, highly encourage it. He's really, really good. And that will ground you in the myths and legends. Then you will know, about Thor and the Frost Giants. You will know about Loki and Balder and the Thistle of Mistletoe. You'll know about Auden and his missing eye. You'll know about the Valkyrior and all of that stuff. That's all so great. It's all such great reading. And while we're on the subject of Viking myths and legends and the Icelandic sagas, you could also pop in on Sagalong. The aforementioned Elena Makridina is hosting a read-along for the month of February about the Icelandic sagas, and I'm part of it. I'm joining. You can too. So I'll leave a link to whatever videos are available for that as well. But I strongly recommend that as a place to start. And then the next place that you want to go after that, you might think, once I've grounded myself in myths and legends, the next place I'll go will be to history. No, not really, because the Vikings really did braid themselves in this sort of thing. It's hard to make the case. It's hard for me to make clear what I'm talking about, but it is very different than the way, for instance, name another legendary warrior band, the Mongols, the Spartans. It's very different from the way they thought about their gods and goddesses, their mythological cycle. On the eve of battle. On the eve of battle, they were concerned with sharpening their swords, polishing their shields, getting their orders straight, getting a good meal, that sort of thing. And on the eve of battle, the Vikings were not concerned with that. They were braided into their myths and legends to a far greater extent than any other discrete warrior phenomenon that I know of in history, except maybe the samurai, but that's a starter kit for another day. One way or another. No, the next books that we want for our starter kit are books that examine that relationship, that examine the myths of Norse mythology braided with the life and the military exploits of Norse mythology. And believe it or not, there are quite a few books on that subject. I want to show you 3 that are really good. You'll notice right away that they're all similar to each other, and these are all new. So they could be in your libraries. The first one is by John Karl Helgason. I don't know if that's how you say his name. This is Echoes of Valhalla. And the subtitle is The Afterlife of the Eddas and Sagas. And that's just what it is. It traces the life of these stories and intertwines them with the lives of people. So it makes for really good reading. And then the next one's very similar, Tales of Valhalla. Same thing, an analysis of the Viking mind and culture and history through the myths and sagas. And this one is by Martyn Whittock and Hannah Whittock. And I liked it. I liked it quite a bit. And then the last one is from Oxford University Press. It is by Eleanor, Rosamund, Barraclough, and it is Beyond the Northlands. And this is the subtitle is The Viking Voyages on the Old Norse Sagas. And again, it's the same thing. It's not just a battle and settlement history of the Vikings. It's in large part a study of where they intersect with their own literature, because that's how important it is, I think, and I think these scholars think so too. And then when we have another raid is in progress. The Vikings didn't do this. A little bit. You're adorable. All right. Then once we're done, I once taught a class that was largely composed, decades and decades ago, that was largely composed of starter kits of one kind or another. Basically, that's what it was, only for literature. And all you think about is what I would think then, if then I knew that I would be doing that now in the unguessable future, and that I would be periodically interrupted by a little schnauzer. So anyway, once you're done with that, once you're done with the mythology, which is going to be a treat for you to read, and then with at least 1 or 2 books on the interweaving of the mythology and the people and the history, then you want to move on to the history itself. Now, the history has some benefits for a newcomer. Benefit number one is that it is discrete. You're not going to have to, it's not the Holy Roman Empire. You're not going to have to master vast open acres of stuff, because the Viking era, let's say for convenience sake, there are isolated instances that are recorded a little bit earlier, but let's say for convenience sake it starts on that early June day in 793. Well, it doesn't last forever. It only lasts for a few centuries. The Vikings coming in greater and greater numbers, conquering more and more land, moving further west and further east, exploring, and also settling, and taking over areas, even fraternizing with the local population. So that era, it has a fairly distinct beginning and it has a fairly distinct ending. Pretty much the last Viking. That you could easily make a case for, at least for, in a popular conception, in an easy way to start, which is the whole point of a starter kit, is that you want to get an early grip on this thing and then go into as much detail as you want. If, in that sense of thinking about it, then the Viking era really ended in 1066, when someone you could easily call the last Viking died on the battlefield in England and lost the day for the English so that the Normans could take over. But that's also a starter kit for another day. We'll do a 1066 starter kit, I guarantee it. But that's advantage number one of the Viking era, is that it's discrete. You can sort of bottle it at both ends, and that is convenient. It's a lot less demoralizing to study a thing like that than it would be to study, for instance, German history, which is ongoing, or the Holy Roman Empire, which is over but had an enormous sprawl of a history. And thing number two about studying the history of the Vikings, as you should have been able to pick up by now, is that it's mighty interesting reading. We're not talking about the Hanseatic League here. We're talking about people whose joys and melancholies were enormous and are very entertaining to read about. So these next batch of books will be history, but even with history there are grades. And to start off with Vikings, I think it always helps to use great visual volumes, maybe volumes that aren't quite so heavy on the research, but that are much better on the visuals, because the Vikings, unlike a lot of discrete historical subsets of people or movements in history, are largely characterized by motion. So seeing maps of their voyages and their conquests helps a lot to understand them. So I've got the two that I've got one that's old, that is very visual, because it's National Geographic, and this is out of print, but at yard sales or thrift shops you should be able to find it. I have seen it everywhere, and it's terrific. It's absolutely terrific. It's The Vikings, by National Geographic, and it has not only their signature, great photography, but it also is full of original artwork. See, there you go. There's a village. I wonder if I can find a picture of combat. Combat would be nice. Of course, there's a Viking. The research on Vikings may have changed. The tenor of it may have changed a little. It was, once upon a time, absolutely standard. For instance, in the Victorian era and slightly afterwards, it was absolutely standard to celebrate the romanticism and the gore and the epic quality of the swashbuckling nature of the Vikings. And as contemporary scholars point out when they write about them now, usually with a tone of wistfulness, that has kind of changed. I don't think there's anything inaccurate about that, though. And I don't think there's much in this book, which is probably 60 years old. I should have checked this ahead of time. Oh, look at that. There they are, braving the oceans. These little ships, they were the masters. This came out in 1972. This came out in 1972, so that's going on 50 years. And I don't think there's anything in here that's not accurate. It's just the tone of it will be different. So if you can find this old volume, you'll really be glad you did, because you'll go back to it over and over again. And then the next one is more modern. The next one is also by Oxford, and it is a series of theirs. They did a series like this. This is the Illustrated History of the Vikings, and they did one of these for Europe and for the Romans and whatnot. These illustrated histories are really, really good because they're put together to show you everything. To show you, you've got the map of the English kingdoms of the day. You've got it will give you great color photos of Viking craft work, but also diagrams of ships and lines of attack and of motion. This is a fantastic resource for getting this is not very long. It gives you a great overview snapshot of the Vikings, their movements, their culture. So I would recommend it very much so if it's at your library, for instance. And then we'll move on to histories. I've got 4 histories here, some more complex than others, all of them really good. And the first one, I think we've seen a lot of these on this channel. The first one is by John Haywood, and it is Northmen, the Viking Saga, from 793 to 1241. He ends at 1241. And all of these are basic retellings, narrative histories of the story that I just outlined, where internal forces in the Northern Islands and the Northern Lands force warrior bands out on looting expeditions, and they become a phenomenon in their own right. And resistance is organized against them. Whole kingdoms are organized against them. They change the world, and then disappear from history. And this is that story. It's tremendously good. So I recommend it. And then the next one captures a little bit more of the spirit of the Vikings than perhaps the Northmen does, and you can tell that in the title right away. This is Tom Shippey laughing, "Shall I die?" And this mainly is it focuses on people, on individual warrior kings and plain old kings and their sons and their families and their dynasties. You get the whole history of the Vikings in here, same as in Northmen and the other books I'm going to mention. But there's much more of a personal element to this. So if that's the way that you like to get into history, then better to look for this thing, which is probably coming up on a paperback sometime this summer. Then the book that I'd want to mention as probably the best soup to nuts history, the best just delving into all areas and yet telling the whole story, is this one. This is by Max Adams, and it's the Viking Wars. It's bigger than any other book that we've been talking about, and it is incredibly interesting. This author takes everything. What is the subtitle here? War and Peace in King Alfred's Britain, 789 to 955. So you concentrate on the part of the Viking experience and era that we know best. But the book ranges out in all directions, tells you the whole Viking story, and boy, oh boy, is it good. Boy, oh boy, is it good. And then the last one, the last history, is a little bit on the specialized side. It is the most erudite. It is the best written of all of these. But you might need to read at least the Oxford Illustrated Guide before you read this one. I don't know, maybe not. But it's fantastic. It's Eric Christiansen. It's The Norsemen in the Viking Age. And it tells the story not only of the men who got into their ships and went reaving and freebooting, but also of all the people who stayed behind. And does a fantastic job at it. Another book that I would strongly recommend that's along these same lines, digs down deep into the nitty-gritty of what we actually know and how we know it, is by Farley Mowat. It's his book West Viking, which is a big fat tome of a thing that's just wonderful. Just wonderful. So I'd recommend this one too. This author has a very Viking sense of humor, a very wry sense of humor. Once you get to know through the sagas and through the at least one or two books on how the sagas intersect with the men and women themselves, once you get to know the Viking mind frame, I think you will find that you like it quite a bit. They are cynical, but they are tongue-in-cheek, and they are masters of comic understatement. Most of them are. Some of them are as venal and idiotic as anybody else you'd find in any age. But the true Vikings, the ones that I love to read about, have a way about them that is downright Klingon. In fact, in this book and in all the other histories, that's what you're going to notice. You're going to notice, those of you who are Star Trek fans are going to notice right away, lots of similarities, and those are reverse engineered. The the writers, the team that was overseeing the show, they would now be called showrunners on Star Trek: The Next Generation, which filled out and fleshed out the Klingons as a people and as a culture. Those writers had the Vikings in mind for quite a bit, which is why Klingons are the foremost, most ferocious warriors in the Alpha Quadrant, but they also have a long history of song. They are utterly barbaric and uncouth, but they are also kind of likable once you get to know them, and obsessed with honor and obsessed with a good death. The parallels are there, and they are meant to be there. Even if you're not expecting it, when you start to read histories of the Vikings, you're going to start to feel that way. I feel sure you are. If that's the modern day pop culture echo that you know, you're going to start to see it when you read about them, and that brings us fairly naturally to pop culture. Vikings have had endless echoes in pop culture, just endless. They are a staple in romance novels, for instance, simply because they're so colorful. They do half the dramatic work of any story. Put a Viking in it, and all of a sudden, and also because they have that human side. They're not exclusively villains. You'll never see a Harlequin romance featuring a Mongol horse lord, but you will see Vikings almost every month. And people like Ben Kane have done long series of Viking fiction that are terrific. A whole bunch of there are two rival Viking series that are both really, really good. If I can, I'll figure out a way to link. I wish I could put pictures in the description, but I'll figure out a way to link to a couple of them below, just to give you an example. And in terms of more literary fiction, Vikings have again been all over literature for 2 centuries. And one of the latest examples of that is something that I have praised on this channel before. I absolutely love it, and I want to recommend it again, and it's this. It's The Half-Drowned King by Linnea Hartsuyker, the first in a trilogy about a semi-legendary, semi-historical Viking figure, and a perfect evocation of their world. These are such wonderful. I don't know that even The Half-Drowned King has come out in paperback yet. The sequel's already out. And the third book will be out, before you know it, probably at the end of the year. And yet I don't think any of them are out in paperback in this country. But you could probably find this one in paperback on Book Depository. And if you're wondering if it's worth your time, it is well worth your time. And, of course, the Viking sagas have also featured in pop culture, including in the strangest place of all, in Marvel Comics. 50 years ago, Stan Lee had the inspired decision to make the Norse god of thunder, Thor, son of Odin, into a superhero. Just foiling crimes on Earth. And at first, he thought nothing of it. At first, Stan Lee thought, I'll have this human discover a walking stick. When he slams it against a wall, it turns into the hammer of Thor, and it turns him into Thor, but he is still him. He's still a human. He's just been transformed. At first, Stan Lee was thinking of it as Captain Marvel, where Billy Batson says the magic word and is transformed into Captain Marvel. But then as issues went on and Stan Lee got into the feel of the character, he started to realize that he would like to tap into Norse mythology, which he knew he'd eaten it up as a kid and older. He'd read all of these sagas, all of these mythological novels. So he decided to do that. He decided to embrace Thor's mythological concepts. All of a sudden, it became harder and harder to believe that the character that Stan Lee was writing every month would ever be part of a team called the Avengers fighting, Doctor Doom. And in Thor's own comic book, once he got his own comic book, Stan Lee started to indulge in that sweet tooth of his by having the first half be the ongoing Thor storyline of whatever was going on, whoever he was fighting. And then the backup feature was called Tales of Asgard, the home of the Norse gods. And they were an occasion for Stan Lee to not only retell lots of Norse mythology, but also to create basically new Norse mythology. And Marvel Comics recently, just a few years ago, reissued Tales of Asgard. They took all those backup features together, put them in one volume, and reissued it with a new dust jacket, hardcover, and most importantly of all, with beautifully redone coloring. It just remastered the whole thing. So that book, it's called Tales of Asgard, or maybe in a library or a bookstore listing, it would be called Thor, Tales of Asgard. I'll leave a link to it down below because I wrote about it. It is well worth your time to get because Stan Lee really understood is Vikings. So believe it or not, I would actually include that in pop culture references to the Vikings. And there are two others that I want to mention. One, probably a lot of you will have thought of first when you saw The Word, which is the History Channel. The History Channel took a chance and did a dramatic series instead of a series of documentaries. They did a dramatic series called The Vikings that was centered around one particular Viking from the exact kind of mytho-history that these books are designed to talk about. The exact kind of mytho-history where we know the person actually existed, but we don't know how much of what's told about him is true and how much of it is myth. They centered a story around that guy. And at first, when I heard it announced, I had no idea what they were going to do. And then I watched it, and it's amazingly good. Just amazingly good and beautifully done. And because it's the History Channel, there's very little in it that is inaccurate. Although they take liberties, of course, the characters see Auden on the battlefield and whatnot. But that seen through the eyes of the characters themselves, what they're seeing doesn't seem unusual at all. I strongly recommend the series Vikings. I don't know if it's on Netflix or whatnot, but if you have access to it somehow and you've been wondering, is this any good? It is very, very good. And the last thing I want to recommend for this Viking starter kit is a movie that's based on a book, but I am not going to recommend the book. The book is by Michael Crichton, and it's The Eaters of the Dead, which is a Viking novel of his, and it is, as everything else that Michael Crichton wrote, execrable. So you might read, Timescape or well, I don't know. The dinosaur novels of Michael Crichton. You might read Michael Crichton for fun, as a kind of an escape. And I don't belittle them for that. Those as popcorn books, they're very good. But this is not a case where the book is better than the movie. The Eaters of the Dead was adapted into a movie starring Antonio Banderas called The 13th Warrior, and it is incredible, absolutely incredible. It looks generic, it looks dismissible. Critics did dismiss it, and if you were to see it, for instance, on Netflix, or although I don't think I've ever seen it on Netflix, or I would watch it every day, but if you were to see it, with the dollar bin of a DVD clearance sale or something like that, you might think, well, yeah, it's probably not anything, and you'd be missing a true gem. It is amazing, absolutely amazing, and it has it's full of humor, and it's full of very Viking style. The Vikings are captured really well in the course of the movie, and it also has the greatest climax of any popular movie that I know of. Certainly ranks right up there with any movie that I know of that isn't popular, even that isn't current. The climax to 13th Warrior is something that you will remember for the rest of your life. So I'm going to recommend that as well. And I will leave extensive links down below to as much of this stuff as I can. And that's it. That is our starter kit for Vikings. If you familiarize yourself with a lot of these things, you'll be ready to tackle anything Viking related that comes along. And I think thereafter you'll be a bit disappointed. I don't think that any year that we're going to see in our lifetime will be as Viking rich as 2018 was. 2018 had probably 20 fantastic new books on Vikings, on all aspects of the Viking phenomenon. And I don't think 2019 has had one yet. So anyway, that's it for now. That is a starter kit on Vikings. And I will check with Elena Makridina for what our next starter kit will be. But in the meantime, I will see you soon. Thank you, Book 2.